Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the fourth self-titled album from Weezer, otherwise known as the White Album. Now, I don't normally talk about artistic legacy on this show, mostly because it would be unbelievably arrogant of me to assume that I could ever dictate the course of history in the modern world with one of these reviews. At the end of the day, history's going to proceed as it may, regardless of any of my contributions. And how much any singular critic's opinion might matter, that's a complex question. Maybe in the years where singular critical voices had more power and more recognizable, which paradoxically in the age of YouTube personalities, that might become a thing again. But when most people read, say, Rolling Stone, or Pitchfork, they consider the review a reflection of the outlet's opinion, not of the individual critic that wrote it. And those outlets have more clout than I can see myself having for several more years at the very least. Now, that being said, when you consider the artistic legacy of an act like Weezer, how do you best describe it? A few solid to excellent albums in the 90s maybe, a return to the form in the 2010s with Everything Will Be Alright in the End in 2014, and between them, a wasteland of records that at best were okay, and at worst were kind of asinine and insufferable. Because make no mistake, Weezer's been around now for over 20 years, and that length of time becomes significant when you realize how much of their discography really doesn't hold up as strongly as you would hope, especially in comparison with their very best. And sure, I can appreciate the relief that Weezer fans must have felt with that record in 2014 actually being good, but at the same time, before going back to hear it for this review, I have not had any urge to go back and re-listen to Everything Will Be Alright in the End the same way I might go back to Pinkerton or the Blue Album. And as such, I had a lot of mixed feelings and emotions about their upcoming newest self-titled record, otherwise known as the White Album. Haha, very clever. And yet I had a lot of reservations about covering it. The first being that I pitched longtime collaborating producer Rick Ocasek for Jake Sinclair, a producer you might recognize from acts like 5 Seconds of Summer or Taylor Swift. It also didn't help matters that the buzz was suggesting that not only was this record more of a concept album, but Rivers Cuomo had once again descended down the lyrical rabbit hole, or up his own ass. It's really kind of interchangeable at this point, and I can't be the only one who has long ago run out of patience for this guy. I mean, I like eccentric out there lyricism that can be tough to decode, but I've got a line when it comes to some lyrics or context and themes, and Rivers Cuomo, he frequently goes over it. So with all those reservations out of the way, how did the White Album turn out? Well, oh man, I'm not gonna make any fans from this review, but let me dissuade you all of some presumptions you might have surrounding my opinions here, because like many people, like most Weezer fans, I wanted this record to be really good, or at the least have more staying power, or show Weezer capable of evolving, given the love letter to their past that was Everything Will Be Alright in the End. It was a chance for new beginnings, a new fresh start. The White Album, it's not that. At least not in the areas where it should be. What it is a sign of Weezer slipping back towards bad habits. And unfortunately, the problems are across the board, to the point where I have a hard time calling this even a good album, let alone a great one. So let's start for a change with the lyrics and the themes, and where you'd think that I'd have the majority of my issues with this album. After all, isn't there where Rivers Cuomo could do the most damage with asinine lyrics? Really, the truth is, despite some baffling lyrical choices, you can't drive a bus to the Galapagos Islands, describing women as alien creatures and evil if they don't say they love you. The continued Asian focus on the song about his wife, King of the World, that runs right up to the point of fetishization, gets a little weird. You know what? I'm being honest here, I've heard far weirder lyrics. And the very loose conceptual framework of the album prevents it from going completely off the deep end. And I'm not going to deny that Rivers Cuomo is a writer that has a lot of moments in crafting radio-friendly hooks that are just weird enough to stand out or have just enough detail to draw a lot of attention. Of course, it helps that Weezer's going back to a very familiar well-end arc for this album. Boy meets girl, girl breaks his heart, boy whines incessantly about it until you kind of want to slug him, but at the same time, you kind of want to feel for his inverted, hormonal, borderline creepy longings. They're somewhat relatable. Hell, when Rivers Cuomo wrote Pinkerton back in 1996, both guys around his age they could empathize. And hell, when you go back through that album, you also get the feeling that he kind of knew just how bad it all looked and never framed the stories all that sympathetic. He just didn't care all that much. He was putting it all out there. But you know what? That was 20 years ago, and Rivers Cuomo was 45. And when you realize that so little of the subject matter, writing, and tone has evolved since Pinkerton, it starts to get a lot less excusable that it can feel as trite as it all is. And sure, I can embrace straightforward poptimism like California Kids, or even Do You Want to Get High, one of the nastier, sleazier songs about smoking up that I've heard in some kind of a novel take, but Thank God for Girls, I wanted to say that the subtext was intentional, showing the nerdy guy in an ugly, submissive relationship, or on the sideline sidelines obsessively craving for it, with the framing to highlight just how kind of creepy and borderline misogynist this entire scene was. Perhaps it's just a bit of self-aware commentary, until I made the mistakes of reading Rivers Cuomo's verified annotations on Genius. And while he's descended behind screens of self-aware ironic detachment for, I got the sinking feeling that this was actually sincere, and yet without the raw insight or cleverness or sense of humor to redeem it. For a counterexample of this done right, Father John Misty might be an enormous douchebag on I Love You Honey Bear from last year, but he tempers it with self-deprecating humor, real wit, and going over the top for maximum melodrama, something that Weezer just doesn't pull off lyrically. And believe me, it definitely colors how you see the rest of the album, because the sloppy framing keeps coming up. From the desperation between the lines on Girl We Got a Good Thing, the borderline pathetic whinging on LA Girls and Jacked Up, the former a dark mirror to the California optimism that piles on the condescension to boot and really got it cut insufferable. And while I want to like Endless Bummer for just trying to play his melancholies a little bit more low-key, it still struck me as a lot of adolescent whining, complaining for summer just be over instead of actually learning anything or developing or moving on. And the tone of the song makes it all the clear that any sort of emotive connection comes with sympathizing with the protagonist, of which I've got no desire to do. The framing just doesn't work here. Now, part of this is Rivers Cuomo's fault, and it's not like his vocals delivery is giving these songs any sort of gravitas or maturity or even self-aware comedy, but this is where we run into what I was dreading about this album: the production. And I'll say, after re-listening to Everything Will Be Alright in the End before this, dropping Rick Ocasek was a mistake. I'm not sure if it's a matter of the ability or just poor production decisions, but in trying to bring back all the rough edges of Weezer's 90 years, Jake Sinclair seems to have completely missed why so much of that material actually worked in the first place. I'd say the problem is the bass line. Sinclair that had worked more with bassist Scott Schreiner here, but that's operating under the assumption you could hear the bass guitar at all. But the levels are off all over this album. The guitars have edge and grit, sure, and there's some decent rhythm lines here and there, but the squealing melodies are either stuck on staccato piano lines or completely marginalized between cymbals that just crack over everything else. While there are a few good solos, California Girls, the meteor solo on LA Girls, the one thing redeeming that song, the ending solo on Endless Bummer, much of the mixing wants to just drown out in feedback and yet never gives it a thick enough edge in the low end to actually land any impact for me, which leaves many of these tracks feeling a lot muddier than they really should, and none of it helps Rivers Cuomo, because not only are his vocals shoved right to the front of the mix, the overdubbing only highlights weaknesses that probably should have been buried. Most notably, his god-awful falsetto and Jacked Up. It sounds horrible. But the largest issue is that many of these tracks just feel undercooked and underdeveloped. Songs that could have used a third verse to tell more of a story, at the very least provide some desperately needed context to flesh out more of this album. This record runs just over a half hour, and it feels thin, even for a summer album that's supposed to be pretty breezy. And that, I think, ties into the main question here. What does anybody expect from Weezer anymore? I can see a lot of fans loving this for noisy riffs and subject matter that on the surface seems to play in the same ballpark as a lot of the greats, and I argue that some fans have probably just accepted a long time ago that you only care about Rivers Cuomo's lyrics on the hook, otherwise just ignore him, he's gonna ramble on regardless. But as a Weezer fan who saw their significantly better 2014 album, Everything Will Be Alright in the End, as a sign that they were going into interesting directions, I'm sorry, this is a step back and a pretty big step down, especially when the melodic hooks aren't given the same punch or emphasis beyond the vocal line. For me, I'm thinking a strong 5 out of 10, and only a recommendation if you're a hardcore fan. But even then, Everything Will Be Alright in the End had a lot more ambition, sharper hooks, and far better production. If I were you, I'd take that, especially over this. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Got the poll right there, so everybody who wants to tell me that I'm wrong, you go rate it up the album up there. I am genuinely curious if your opinion, especially if you're a hardcore Weezer fan, did this live up to your expectations? Because not for me. And yes, if you wonder why there haven't been as many reviews recently, I was sick Thursday, Friday, part of Saturday. Just wasn't a good situation all around. But I'm on the recovery, so I got a lot of ground to catch up. So don't leave me any recommendations. I got a pretty thick list. I'll be working my way through as many as I can. But anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.